The house is quiet. Dust has found its way under the door again, the way it does every day now, no matter how many rags are pressed into the gap. It sits on the windowsill. It coats the kitchen table before the cloth even finishes wiping it clean. Outside, the sky has disappeared behind a wall of brown that hasn't fully lifted in days. Inside, a family is counting what's left. It doesn't take long. A small amount of flour, a few potatoes, some jars, half full, in the cellar. A little fuel for the stove. Clothing that has already been patched more than once. Money, what little there was, has nearly disappeared. And yet, dinner will still happen tonight. Tomorrow will still come. The children will still need shoes eventually. The stove will still need fuel. Someone in this house will still have to figure out how to make what's left stretch one more day. So here's the question. This film is going to sit with. How does a family survive when almost every resource it depended on fails at the same time? The crops are failing. The livestock is suffering. The land itself is blowing away, in some places literally lifting off the fields and drifting for miles. Banks are failing. Jobs have all but vanished. And yet, somehow, millions of ordinary families kept going. What did they know about surviving with almost nothing that has largely disappeared from modern memory? Chapter 1. When the farm stopped providing to understand how families survived the Dust Bowl, you first have to understand that it wasn't a single disaster. It was several disasters, arriving at once and feeding on each other. A severe, sustained drought settled across the Great Plains beginning in the early 1930s, hitting states including Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico with particular severity. But drought alone doesn't explain what happened. Decades of agricultural expansion had stripped away the native grasses that once held the plains' topsoil in place, replacing them with wheat and other row crops whose root systems couldn't anchor the soil the same way once the rains stopped. When drought arrived, the exposed, overfarmed soil had nothing left to hold it down. Winds picked it up in massive, rolling storms, some large enough to be tracked all the way to cities on the East Coast. This environmental collapse landed directly on top of the broader economic collapse of the Great Depression, which was already suppressing crop prices and drying up credit before the dust storms began in earnest. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand their operations during better years found themselves unable to repay those debts as yields collapsed and prices fell further still. Foreclosures followed. So did widespread unemployment, as agricultural labor, already seasonal and precarious, became nearly impossible to find. The result was a crisis with no single cause and no single fix: environmental catastrophe, agricultural practice, and economic collapse, all reinforcing one another. For households living through it, this meant ordinary household budgeting stopped being a matter of careful habit and became, quite literally, a matter of survival. Chapter 2. The first rule: waste nothing. Out of this collapse came a governing household philosophy, one that touched nearly every object and every decision inside the home: waste nothing. Clothing was repaired rather than replaced. Fabric scraps were saved and reused. Jars, tins, and other containers were kept and reused rather than discarded. Furniture was mended. Tools were repaired and sharpened rather than replaced when they dulled or broke. Food was portioned with real precision, because a portion misjudged one night could mean less available a few nights later. It's worth being clear that most of these practices weren't invented by the Dust Bowl. Many were already common in rural households and working-class families across the country, part of a broader culture of thrift documented in agricultural extension bulletins, home economics literature, and household manuals of the era. What the Dust Bowl did was strip away any remaining margin for casual waste. Practices that had once been sensible habits became, for many families, the literal difference between managing and not managing. The household became something close to a system, a set of interlocking decisions designed to extract the maximum possible usefulness out of a shrinking pool of resources. What happens to a family that has already repaired everything it owns, and there is still nothing left to sell? Chapter 3. The kitchen became a survival machine. If any single room carried the weight of Dust Bowl survival, it was the kitchen. Meals were built around inexpensive, calorie-dense staples: beans, potatoes, cornmeal, and whatever seasonal produce a household could grow, preserve, or afford. Bread, when available, was stretched, used to thicken soups, repurposed once stale rather than discarded. Soups and stews served the dual purpose of extending small amounts of meat or vegetables across multiple meals while requiring less fuel than more elaborate cooking, an important consideration when fuel itself was scarce and costly. Home food preservation, canning, pickling, and drying played a critical role for households that had access to any surplus produce to preserve, whether from their own land or through community exchange. This work was demanding, requiring both the equipment and the time to do it, and it wasn't equally accessible to every household. Families without land, without canning equipment, or without the fuel to run a canner for hours faced real limits on how much they could preserve, regardless of how much they wanted to. Leftovers were treated as a matter of course rather than an afterthought. A family meal was frequently planned several days in advance around how a single piece of meat, a pot of beans, or a batch of cornbread could be extended forward. Portion control wasn't a diet strategy, it was arithmetic, practiced daily, often by whoever managed the household's food supply. The distinction that matters here isn't simply that families had very little food. It's that surviving well under these conditions required actual practiced knowledge, knowing which ingredients stretched furthest, which combinations of scarce staples produced a filling meal, and how to plan several days of eating around a single limited resource. Chapter 4. The garden that could mean the difference. Household gardens mattered enormously to Dust Bowl survival, where they were possible. It's important not to overstate this. Drought, depleted or wind-stripped soil, and severely limited water access made gardening extraordinarily difficult across much of the hardest-hit Dust Bowl region during the worst years of the crisis. This wasn't a universal solution available to every household simply through effort and will. But where conditions allowed even a modest garden, whether because a family had access to a well, a slightly more sheltered plot of land, or simply a stretch of less severely affected soil, vegetables, beans, and potatoes could meaningfully supplement a family's food supply. Poultry, where households could keep and feed it, provided both eggs for regular consumption and, when necessary, meat, along with a small and occasionally vital source of income through egg sales. The underlying principle that emerges from this chapter isn't really about gardening specifically. It's about diversification. Households that depended on a single source of food or income were far more vulnerable than those who had built even a second or third modest source to fall back on when the primary one failed. In a crisis defined by cascading failures, never depending entirely on one source of anything became, for many families, an essential piece of practical wisdom. Chapter 5. Clothing that passed through 3 lives. Clothing during this period rarely had a single life. It had several. A garment might begin as adult clothing, be patched and mended repeatedly as it wore, eventually be cut down and re-sewn into children's clothing once it was too worn for adult use, and finally, once truly beyond wearing, be repurposed again as work cloth or cleaning material. Nothing about this progression was considered remarkable. It was simply understood as how clothing worked when replacing it wasn't a realistic option. Darning, rebuilding worn areas of socks and other garments by weaving new thread through the damaged section, was common household knowledge, typically passed from mother to daughter as an ordinary domestic skill rather than a specialized craft. Buttons, hooks, and other small fittings were saved and reused rather than purchased new. Fabric scraps, too small or worn for clothing, were repurposed into quilts, patches, or rags. This wasn't primarily about creativity or thrift as a value in itself. Clothing represented labor, scarce cash, and materials that were genuinely difficult to replace under these conditions. A hole in a garment wasn't treated as the end of that garment's usefulness. It was simply the signal that another repair was due. Chapter 6. The Hidden Economy of Neighbors. No household survived the Dust Bowl entirely on its own resources, and this documentary would be incomplete if it suggested otherwise. Rural communities across the Great Plains relied heavily on informal exchange between neighbors. Food, labor, tools, transportation, childcare, seeds, and practical information all moved between households according to who had a surplus and who had a need at any given moment. A family with a working well might share water. A family with surplus seed might share it with a neighbor who had lost theirs. Labor for demanding seasonal tasks was frequently shared between neighboring farms, since few individual households could manage certain jobs entirely alone. Churches, local charities, and community organizations also played meaningful roles in many areas, providing both material assistance and a network through which information about available help could travel. These informal and community-based systems of support existed alongside, and in many cases predated, the more formal government relief efforts that expanded through the decade. The lesson embedded in this chapter is a genuinely important one. Sometimes the most valuable resource available to a struggling household wasn't sitting in the house at all. It was the relationship with a neighbor who could help, and the willingness to ask. Chapter 7. When money disappeared. As cash income collapsed for many farming families through the early and mid-1930s, households adjusted their financial behavior in whatever ways circumstances allowed. Barter arrangements, trading goods or labor directly rather than exchanging cash, appear in period accounts and oral histories, particularly between neighboring farms and within small rural communities where cash was scarce for nearly everyone simultaneously. Local merchants sometimes extended informal credit to longtime customers, though this wasn't a guaranteed or universal option, and many families had genuinely limited access to credit of any kind. Purchases beyond immediate necessity were delayed, often indefinitely. Households sold possessions, furniture, tools, sometimes livestock, when there was simply no other way to raise needed cash. Family members took on whatever temporary or seasonal work could be found, even far from home, to bring in income during periods when the farm itself produced little or nothing. It's important not to romanticize any of this. Barter and informal credit were not reliable substitutes for real income, and many families found their options for either severely constrained. What this period demonstrates isn't a clever financial workaround. It's the sheer degree of constant adjustment households were forced into as their circumstances kept shifting under them. Chapter 8. The government entered the kitchen. Private household frugality, however resourceful, could not solve a crisis of this scale on its own, and it's important that this documentary doesn't suggest otherwise. The New Deal introduced a range of programs directly relevant to Dust Bowl survival. The Farm Security Administration provided loans and assistance to struggling farm families and documented rural conditions extensively through its photography program, leaving behind much of the visual record this documentary and others draw upon. The Works Progress Administration created employment on public projects for those who could no longer find agricultural work. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men on conservation projects, including efforts related to soil erosion control. Agricultural assistance programs offered support for farmers navigating the collapse of crop prices and, later in the decade, promoted new soil conservation practices aimed at preventing future erosion disasters of this scale. Resettlement programs assisted some families in relocating to areas with better prospects. This assistance mattered enormously and mattered differently for different families. For some households, government relief was genuinely the difference between weathering the crisis in place and being forced to leave entirely. This chapter exists specifically to push back against any narrative suggesting Dust Bowl families survived purely through private household ingenuity. Sometimes survival required outside help, and a great many families received it. Chapter 9. The Decision to Leave. For some families, no amount of frugality, repair, or careful planning could solve the underlying problem. The land simply wasn't producing enough, there was no money, and there was no local work to be found. Faced with this, families had to decide whether to stay and continue adapting or to leave. Significant numbers of families did migrate out of the hardest-hit areas of the Great Plains during the 1930s, with many heading toward California and other states in search of agricultural or other work. A migration extensively documented in period journalism, government reports, and first-hand accounts, and later shaped in popular memory by works like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. It's worth noting, though, that not every Dust Bowl migrant fit the popular image built around that story, and migration patterns, destinations, and outcomes varied considerably by family circumstance and region. The decision to leave carried enormous emotional weight. It meant leaving behind a home, often land that had been in a family for a generation or more. It meant selling off possessions that couldn't be transported. It meant packing only what could fit into a vehicle or wagon and setting out with children toward genuinely uncertain prospects. In its own way, this was the ultimate frugal decision available to a household. Recognizing that a resource, in this case the land itself, could no longer sustain the family, and that continuing to invest effort into staying might cost more than starting over somewhere else. Chapter 10. The System That Kept Them Going. Bringing these threads together, a clear pattern of household behavior emerges from this period. Not a single trick, but an interlocking set of practices. Waste as little as possible. Make possessions last through repair rather than replacement. Stretch food deliberately and plan meals around what needs to be extended. Diversify food sources wherever circumstances allow, rather than depending on any single supply. Repair before replacing, as a near-automatic first response. Share resources with neighbors, understanding that mutual aid moves in both directions over time. Accept outside help, from neighbors, from charities, from government programs, when private resources genuinely run out. Delay purchases beyond immediate necessity. Adapt quickly as circumstances continue shifting, because static plans failed fast in this environment. And, when none of the above could resolve the underlying problem, recognize when survival requires leaving altogether. None of these were uniquely Dust Bowl inventions. Most drew from long-standing rural and working-class traditions that predated the crisis by generations. What the Dust Bowl did was strip away any illusion that these habits were optional. It made their value impossible to ignore. Chapter 11. What outlasted the dust? The Dust Bowl ended, eventually. The rains returned, the worst of the storms passed, and by the early 1940s, wartime demand for crops had begun pulling the region's economy back up off the ground. But the decade left behind more than ruined farms and hard memories. It left behind changes that outlasted the crisis itself, both in the land and in the people who had lived through it. On the land, the response to the Dust Bowl reshaped American farming practice for generations. Contour plowing, strip cropping, shelter belts of trees planted specifically to break the wind, and a new federal apparatus built around soil conservation all emerged directly out of the lessons of this decade. An acknowledgement, at a national level, that the land itself had to be managed differently if a disaster like this one wasn't going to repeat itself. Some of these practices are still standard agricultural policy today, quietly present in fields most people driving past would never think to connect back to the 1930s. In households, the habits went further still. Families who had learned to stretch food, repair rather than replace, preserve everything they could, and depend on neighbors when their own resources ran out, carried a great deal of that knowledge forward, not because the crisis that demanded it was still active, but because the habits themselves had become part of how they understood a well-run household. Many of the same families who survived the Dust Bowl went on, within a few short years, to face wartime rationing during the Second World War, and found that skills learned out of desperate necessity in the 1930s translated almost directly into what the government was now asking every American household to practice voluntarily. The line between Dust Bowl frugality and wartime frugality in a great many households was barely a line at all, and the knowledge kept moving forward from there, into the households their children built, sometimes deliberately taught, sometimes absorbed simply by growing up watching a parent who never quite lost the habit of saving a scrap of fabric or finishing every scrap of food on a plate, decades after there was any strict necessity left to explain why. Chapter 12. One more thing. Go back to that kitchen table. The one dust kept finding its way onto no matter how many rags were pressed against the door. Somewhere, a family finished that meal. Somewhere, that same family planted again the following spring, or packed what little they had and left for somewhere else entirely. Either way, they carried the same thing forward, not the dust and not the hunger, but the knowing how to make what remained enough, one more time, for as long as it took. Nobody in that kitchen thought of themselves as remarkable. They weren't trying to build a legacy, or teach a lesson, or leave anything behind for a documentary to find decades later. They were just getting through the day in front of them, the way they'd gotten through the one before it, the way they'd have to get through the one after. That's easy to lose sight of when a story like this gets told in hindsight, with all the shape and meaning history adds after the fact. At the time, it wasn't a system. It was just what Tuesday required, and yet the shape is there, if you look for it. In a grandmother who still rinsed and saved every jar decades after the Depression ended. In a grandfather who could never quite bring himself to throw away a piece of scrap wood. In a family recipe that started, quietly, as a way to stretch a single chicken across 3 different meals and never stopped being made that way, long after stretching a chicken had stopped being necessary. The Dust Bowl is gone. The habits it left behind sometimes weren't. Not for a long time. Not until the people who'd lived through it finally weren't around to keep practicing them. Somewhere, that knowledge is still one generation away from disappearing entirely, in a family that hasn't thought to ask an older relative about it yet. That's what actually survived the Dust Bowl. Nothing here has magically improved. The dust is still outside. The cupboards are still nearly bare. But this family knows what to do. The food has been stretched. The clothes have been mended again. The neighbors have helped where they could. And somewhere in this house, a decision about tomorrow, stay, plant again, or finally go, is quietly being made. That is the forgotten system, not a miracle, a way of thinking built out of necessity. If everything you depended on disappeared tomorrow, how much of that knowledge would you still have? How many families were forced to make these same calculations before the decade was over? If someone in your own family lived through this, a grandparent, a great-grandparent who never talked much about it, but who never wasted a scrap of food or a worn piece of clothing for the rest of their life, tell us about them in the comments. Their knowledge deserves to be remembered, not just endured and forgotten. And if you want more of these forgotten survival stories brought back to the surface, subscribe. There's more of this history still waiting to be told.